Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. A while back we painted this Blood Angels Scout. The armor is a darker red than we normally see on Blood Angels, and I got a few requests for a brighter red armor. We'll use a mix of contrast paints and traditional methods. We also have a set of recipe cards to go along with this video, and you can download them and print them out. Details about how to get them will be down in the description below. The first half of the video will be beginner friendly, and we'll cover the basics and paint the model to a battle-ready quality. In the second half, we'll spend a little more time and add some highlights. So let's grab our brushes and get started. The model will be easier to paint in a sub-assembly, and I attached the parts to corks for easier handling, followed by an undercoat of a bright white primer. A white undercoat is necessary for a vibrant red finish, and I wouldn't recommend using a gray or bone-colored undercoat. Any color other than white will darken and dull down the end result. I began with a base coat of Magmadroth Flame contrast paint. I like to work on one section at a time and apply the paint carefully for an even finish. My goal with this stage is to get an even layer of paint, which will work as a base coat for the next layers. Since contrast paints are semi-transparent, some of this orange will show through when we paint red over it next, and it will result in a much warmer red. With the orange base coat dry, next I painted a layer of Blood Angels red over the armor. I like to use plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses, and then use the brush to soak up any excess paint. It can be difficult to get a smooth finish with contrast paints, especially on models that have a lot of flat surfaces such as Space Marines. It's important to be quick, but not overwork the paint. I find that short, quick brush strokes can help. But no matter what, it's never going to be perfectly even, and you'll have to do some touch-up work if you want it to look really smooth. The layer of red paint is dry, and there are quite a few areas where it looks uneven. A glaze can help smooth out the rough spots. I diluted some Blood Angels red with an equal amount of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I painted a thin layer over the uneven sections. You can build up a few layers if you want to, but keep in mind that each layer will make the end result look darker. Do the best you can with a layer or two of this glaze, and if you want to smooth it out more, I'll show how to fix that in the second half of the video. We'll leave the red armor for now and move on to painting a few areas with black paint. Since this is a sergeant, his shoulder pads will be black, and it'll take a couple thin layers for a solid, smooth finish. I also painted a narrow outline of black paint around all the other areas on the model. This is a technique often called blacklining, and it will give the model a lot of extra definition. Next I painted all the joints and back vents with gray number 3 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Mechanicus Standard Gray is pretty close. These areas are really difficult to access, and it's almost impossible to paint them without making mistakes. I think it's easier to just try my best and not worry if any mistakes do happen. They're easy to fix during the highlighting stage later. Then I shaded the joints with Black Templar. I like taking this approach to painting the joints. The end result is black with dark gray highlights on the edges, and it's much faster and easier than base coating with black paint and highlighting all the lines individually. I base coated all the metal areas next with Iron Hand steel, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for a smooth, even finish. Next I shaded the steel with a mix I affectionately call Armor Wash. This is a mix of equal parts Ratling Grime, Contrast Medium, and Lamian Medium. I like metallic areas to have really dark shadows, and I found myself having to apply 2 or even 3 layers of shade paints, such as Nuln Oil, in order to get the depth that I wanted. So in order to save time, I developed this mix. It's stronger than the shade paints, and I can usually get dark enough shadows in just one layer. I'm a big fan of the classic color schemes, so I decided to go with yellow for the accent colors and the bolter. I base coated those areas with Averland Sunset, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for a solid, even finish. Don't forget to leave a narrow outline of black as well. Next I shaded the yellow areas with a generous layer of Casandora yellow. If you want the shadows to be a deeper shade, you could paint a second layer after the first one dries. The next few colors will all have a common shade, so I'm going to paint the base coats first and then shade all those areas at the same time later. I painted the parchment with Zandri dust, making sure to leave a narrow black outline where it meets up against the armor. Then I painted the wax part of the purity seals and the sword grip with Screamer Pink. I painted the Crux Terminatus with gray number 3 from my custom grayscale, and if you don't feel like mixing anything, Mechanicus Standard Gray is close. Before I base coat the brass sections, I painted a narrow black outline and allowed it to dry. Then I painted those areas with Runelord brass. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for a bright, even finish. With all those areas base coated, next I shaded them with my armor wash mix. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use Nuln Oil instead, but you may need a second layer for darker shadows. At this stage you could assemble and base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to add some more details and highlights, so let's keep going. First thing I want to address is the armor. Contrast paints are not ideal for painting Space Marines, and if you want really smooth results, it's going to take some extra work with glazing. Contrast paints pool and create both light and dark areas on the model. You'll need to find opaque paints that are close to the light and dark colors, and use those to make the corrections and smooth out the surface. For the armor on this model, Evil Sunz Scarlet and Khorne Red are very close matches to the contrast base coat. Starting with Evil Sunz Scarlet, thin the paint with plenty of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, paint a thin layer on the top portions of the armor and gradually fade it out into the darker section. Notice how there is barely any paint going on the model, and it dries almost immediately. These glaze layers are semi-transparent, and they allow the base layers to show through slightly. Build up one layer on top of another, focusing on dark spots and anywhere you want the armor to be lighter. I use the same glazing process for the darker sections, with a mix of Khorne Red and a small amount of Evil Sunz Scarlet. The exact ratio will vary from model to model, depending on how dark your base coat dried. Test it on a small area and adjust the mix as needed. Thin the paint with water, and remember to have very little on your brush. If it runs off the brush or if it pools, it means your brush is overloaded. Build up thin layers in the darker sections until you're happy with the finish. The armor is looking a lot smoother, and now it's time to add some highlights. I began by painting all the edges with Wild Rider Red. You'll want to make this first highlight wider than the next ones, and a good rule of thumb is to take the thinnest line you can make and double it. That way there's enough room for the next highlights to fit inside that line. If any of the edge highlights look too wide, you can go back to Evil Sunz Scarlet and cover up a part of it. Next I highlighted the edges with Fire Dragon. I painted most of the upward facing edges and some of the lower edges as well. This is a very stylized form of highlighting, and I'm not too concerned with establishing a specific light source. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, please consider Patreon or a YouTube channel membership. We have some perks including a Discord server, printer-friendly PDF files of our new recipe cards, and early access to videos. For the final highlight, I mixed equal parts Fire Dragon and white and painted a few accent highlights on the sharpest edges and corners. It can be easy to overdo this step, so I think it's a good idea to paint these highlights sparingly. You can always add more later if you want to. A high-quality Kolinsky sable brush is really important for painting sharp lines. I'm using a Series 33 Kolinsky sable brush from Rosemary and Co, and I really like their brushes. If you'd like to get some, I have an affiliate link in the video description if you'd like to support the channel with your purchase. Moving on to the yellow parts next, I painted the edges with a sharp highlight of moon yellow. Next, I painted a few spots of toxic yellow on the sharpest edges and corners. I like to highlight the black shoulder pads with a cool gray to offset all the warm colors on the model. I highlighted the edges with a narrow line of Incubi darkness. Just like with the red armor, try to make this highlight the same width as the Wild Rider red line. That way there will be enough space for the next highlights to go. Next I painted an even more narrow line of Russ gray along the edges. Russ gray is a fairly weak color, and you may need to paint a second layer for an opaque finish. Just take your time and paint slowly, and if you make any mistakes, they're easy to fix with some thinned black paint. Finally, I painted a few accent highlights with gray Seer on the sharpest edges and corners. Next I highlighted the stone with a glaze of gray number 4 from my custom grayscale, and if you don't feel like mixing anything, Dawnstone is pretty close. The goal here is to create some soft highlights with a subtle blend, and then I'll paint some sharper edge highlights next. With the soft highlights done, next I painted some sharp edge highlights with gray number 5 from my custom grayscale. And if you don't feel like mixing anything, Administratum gray is close. I highlighted the back vents and joints with a sharp line of gray number 4. Next I worked on the parchment with a glaze style highlight of Zandri dust. Just like with the stone highlights, dilute the paint with water, and with barely any paint on the brush, build up a few layers to lighten some of the parchment. Pay attention to the creases and folds, and build up more paint on the raised areas where the light would hit, and apply less paint in the recessed areas. I highlighted the parchment one more time with Bonewhite. This color is a pretty big jump up in value, so I painted this as a glaze as well, so the highlights don't stand out too much. I focused these highlights on the edges and sharpest folds. Thinned black paint is great for adding text to the parchment. I diluted it with 1 or 2 parts water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I painted a few lines to resemble text. Next I highlighted the sword grip and purity seal wax with Pink Horror. I diluted the paint with a small amount of water and picked out the sharpest edges. I want these areas to look like a dark maroon color rather than pink, so I'm trying to keep the lines very sharp and narrow. That way I can get the extra definition that a highlight provides without the color looking too light. I thought the shade didn't darken the metal enough, so I painted some glazes with black paint diluted with water. I like to alternate the shading on blades, with a very dark shadow at one end and a very bright highlight directly opposite of it. It's not very realistic, but I think it makes the metal look more striking and more reflective. The shade earlier dulled down the metal's shine, and in order to bring that shine back, I painted a glaze highlight of Iron Hand steel. I like to think of this glaze as polishing the metal, and I treat the reflectiveness as a highlight, so I don't want to paint the glaze everywhere. I'm painting it in the areas where I want the light to be the strongest, and nowhere else. I like to paint some on the side of the sword directly opposite of the dark shadows, to increase the contrast, and in a few areas here and there on the bolter as well. Next I highlighted the edges of the steel with Stormhost silver. I'd like to paint a subtle, glowing kind of effect on the power sword, and I began with some Baharroth blue on this wire detail. I'm not really sure what it's called, and if you know what it is, please let me know down in the comments. Then I highlighted the end with a dot of white. Next I painted a few layers of Aethermatic blue contrast paint. The more layers you apply, the stronger the color will be. 3 layers looked good to me, so I stopped there. I highlighted the brass areas next with an equal parts mix of Stormhost silver and Runelord brass. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use Canoptic alloy instead. I base coated the gems and rivets next with diluted black paint. And then I painted the rivets with Stormhost silver, leaving a thin, black outline. I base coated the eye lenses with Baharroth blue, leaving a narrow black outline. Then I highlighted the center of the lenses with white. Next I painted a thin layer of Aethermatic blue. After that dried, I darkened one side of each eye with a small amount of Aeldari emerald. Finally, I added a small dot of white in the corner. I base coated the green gems with Toxic Yellow, leaving a narrow black outline. Then I painted each gem with a thin layer of Karandras green. After that dried, I painted Aeldari Emerald inside each triangle on the pyramid-shaped gem, leaving the lighter green on the edges. Finally, I painted a few white dots. If a model has push-fit joints, I like to clip off most of the pins before assembling with superglue. I think the pieces usually go together easier that way. Using an old brush, I applied a layer of textured paste to the base. Before the paste dried, I sprinkled on a few pieces of coarse gravel and used the backside of a brush to push the gravel into the paste. Then I sprinkled on some fine sand. After the base dried, I painted the ground with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Steel Legion drab. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base black, and after that dried, I added patches of dead static grass with superglue. I used a decal setting solution and added the chapter symbol to the shoulder pad. The yellow looks too bright, so after the decal dried, I painted over it with thinned Averland Sunset, and then I shaded the symbol with a couple glazes of Cassandora yellow. After that dried, I painted a thin layer of Lamian medium over the decal to dull down any remaining shine. I'd like to give a big shout out to our supporters here on YouTube and Patreon. Thank you so much for your support, it really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below or follow the Patreon link in the video description. Thank you! Contrast paints are great at some applications, like organic and heavily textured surfaces, but smooth surfaces like Space Marine armor present a big challenge. I keep trying to find ways of making contrast paints work on Space Marines, and while I can get some decent results, it ends up taking a lot longer than if I just painted them the old-fashioned way. Contrast saves time during the initial base coat stage, but I find that later I have to spend a ton of time fixing blemishes and smoothing out the surface later. What do you think? Do you use contrast paint on Space Marines, or do you prefer the traditional methods with opaque paints? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting!